Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Star Wars Rebel Assault for DOS, Sega CD, Macintosh, and 3DO. This is a rail shooter by LucasArts that was released in 1993 and is actually the first CD-ROM only game that they ever made. And obviously that was a fairly big deal at the time because CD-ROMs were a pretty new technology as far as PC games as well as other kinds of games went. And a lot of people were starting to jump on the bandwagon throughout the early to mid-90s. And with LucasArts being the way it was, of course they jumped on the bandwagon and threw in their lot in the CD game early. And what you ended up with was this particular game, Rebel Assault, which was kind of forgotten, actually, and particularly in favor of the sequel, Rebel Assault 2: The Hidden Empire, which I will, of course, review later on. But the game did receive a fairly mixed to negative response when it came out, with people praising, of course, its high technology at the time, its graphics, its sound, and such like that, but heavily criticizing other elements of the game. And that begs the question, what is this thing really like? Is it a prime example of just leaping on the technology bandwagon and just kind of rolling with that entirely? Or is it actually a really good game that is just kind of caught up in the sea of CD-ROM rail shooters and such? Well, let's delve right into this thing and find out. Well, as far as presentation goes, you do have to keep in mind that the game was originally released in 1993 and it has aged considerably. That said, it looked fantastic for its time, at least with the PC and 3DO versions, because the Sega CD version actually saw a very significant downgrade in its visuals. But what you're seeing in this video is the PC version, or DOS version I should say, and as you can see, it actually looks alright. I mean, it definitely looks very, very dated, but even today, the pixel art is pretty well done for the most part. It's kind of hard to tell what some objects are sometimes, and there is a really, really nasty problem with the environments just kind of blending in, and it's being hard to tell exactly what objects you need to avoid and what objects are just kind of background. And that does become pretty problematic considering that there are a lot of levels in this thing where you're having to dodge scenery, and it becomes kind of hard to tell what scenery needs to be dodged. So while it did look great for its time, it ultimately just kind of interferes with the gameplay more than anything else, just by nature of the art style they went with, and not doing enough to just kind of make the objects that are going to be collision detection problems pop out to the player to be able to be, oh, well, that I need to dodge, definitely, and this other thing is just set dressing. But I'll get more into the issues that has with gameplay in a moment. Before we get to that, though, the sound design is worth mentioning as well, because it's really high-end for its time. Every single character in the game is voiced, and most of them are voiced adequately to pretty decently, although it does have that problem of being fairly early 90s voice acting, which was inevitably rather cheesy. But when you get down to it, that actually just adds to the charm of the game rather than is a detriment, so there's nothing really problematic there. Nor is there anything particularly problematic with the rest of the sound design, because you got sound effects that were pretty much lifted from the movies. I mean, they weren't directly lifted from the movies, obviously, but they're very much in keeping with what you would have seen in the original trilogy, and it definitely gives an authentic vibe. Same goes for the music. It's the John Williams score, and it works very well, even though it is kind of compressed and not really sounding as great as a full-on orchestral soundtrack would later on. But hey, we got the actual Star Wars music and the actual Star Wars sound effects, so at the very least it looks and sounds pretty authentic. But ultimately what really matter here are the story and the gameplay, and the story in this is that you play as Rookie 1, a fresh rebel pilot who was originally from Tatooine, and you find yourself just going through various conflicts as the rebels during the Galactic Civil War. Mostly taking place during Episode 4, but it also does include a few things from Episode 5. And it starts out with Rookie 1's training, and that goes through 3 missions of nothing but training before you finally get to take on the Empire by attacking the Star Destroyer that captured Leia's ship at the beginning of Episode 4. And right off the bat, it introduces the major problem that this thing has as far as its story goes. It tries to shoehorn way too many of the actual movie moments into the game. and it doesn't really have too much of an identity of its own, really. It just kind of tries to recreate the feeling of the movies in a rail shooter format, and it doesn't really do a particularly great job of it. So even though it does look and sound the part of Star Wars, as a piece of Star Wars media and a video game, it doesn't really add much to the table, when it does actually add anything anyway. And you end up with a generally underwhelming Star Wars plotline that is just trying too hard to be like the movies, which is admittedly a problem that a lot of Star Wars games have had. But really, it's not the plot that becomes the problem in this game. Sure, the plot's kinda weak, but you can just kinda set that aside. It was a fairly early rail shooter Star Wars game. Maybe it was a bit unreasonable to expect more than just trying to follow with the movies. No, what really becomes problematic in this game is its actual gameplay. Like I've said several times now, this is a rail shooter, which means that it just goes without your input, and you have to aim and shoot at things as they come up to you. And that can be anything from asteroids to ships to turrets and such like that. But they also throw in an element of actual piloting, where you have to steer your ship to some degree in order to avoid obstacles. Now, this is most noticeable in the moments where you're actually having to dodge things in actual canyon runs and things like that, those ultimately being a little more than obstacle courses, but it's also during the actual shooting segments, and the way they've set up the controls with this is incredibly awkward. You don't have any separate controls for aiming and moving, so it's all done with either the mouse or the joystick. And let me tell you right off the bat, if you were to try to play this thing with a mouse, good luck, because it's basically impossible. What you see in this video is me playing it with a joystick that I recently acquired. And as you can see, I'm just kind of flying all over the damn place and not really able to shoot much of anything with any reliable sort of accuracy or anything like that. And that's because the controls in this game are downright atrocious. It's actually ridiculously difficult to describe just how awful they feel. It feels like you're trying to pilot the thing, but every very slight adjustment that you make sends you careening all over the damn place, and every single time you try to open fire on something, your reticle just never seems to actually lock on, even though it's actually displaying the locked on thing in its heads-up display. And so you try to correct your aiming only to have it not go where you're really wanting it to go, or not go in the appropriate speed in order to be able to catch what you're aiming at, and you just end up missing the target entirely. Now, you take damage for every obstacle that you hit, as well as when there's ships involved that are coming in to fight you. Whenever one of those flies past the screen, you take damage from that as well. So, what ends up happening is that you're going to take a lot of damage from just kind of bouncing all over the place after you run into various obstacles, which is just ridiculous in and of itself, but you're also going to take a lot of damage from all of those targets that you keep missing because you just can't aim well. And it's not even really a matter of, oh, well, DW, you just suck at the game. The funny thing about this is that I've had this thing since about 1993 or 94. I can't remember exactly what year I got it, but I've definitely had it since around the time it came out. And I was actually better at it back in the day. And even then, back in the day, I never managed to finish the game just because of the not being able to hit anything, or dodge anything, as it were. And what you end up with is a ridiculously frustrating game. And I really feel sorry for the people who played this thing on Sega CD, because even as bad as the controls are on PC, they are far worse on that system. And so the game is basically unplayable on Sega CD. It's pretty much unplayable on PC and 3DO, just borderline unplayable. And ultimately, there's really not much reason to look at this thing other than the nostalgia factor if you played it back in the day and you happen to be nostalgic over it. Or you're just looking to see the historical significance of LucasArts' first fully CD-ROM only game. But as far as being a solid rail shooter, it's not. It's downright awful. and it only seems to get worse the more you play it and the more difficult the game gets as a result. I mean, they don't even have really all that many level skip codes that you can enter. You can enter a few codes to skip around to certain levels, but not all of them. At least I never managed to get all the level skip codes to work properly anyway. So I can only skip to a few levels here and there, and I just had to deal with whatever the game threw at me as a result. And that became really problematic when I was trying to get footage for this review, because I was like, oh, well, I might like to do this particular level or this particular level, and the game was like, nope, you can only do these particular levels, because there's only so much I can put up with this game before I just say screw it and quit. And it's worth noting that that is a huge contrast from the way I feel about its sequel, which is of course going to be my next review after this one. So stay tuned for that. But as far as the original Rebel Assault goes, avoid it like the plague. You're not really missing anything other than a very disappointing, extremely difficult to play rail shooter that just doesn't really go anywhere and doesn't really add anything to the Star Wars license. Thanks for watching.